Having already sketched the battlement and tasted the vision of ruin he'd promised his father, the protagonist's smirk hardened into intent. Close-ups lingered on his narrowed eye and the predatory curl of his mouth as he muttered that it was time to begin. A sudden, sharp demand escaped him. He needed a place to work without interruptions. Chaos bent to that will. Torches along the parapet flared to life, and the air vibrated with expectation. Where a prepared escape and cold planning had been, the scene pivoted toward raw power. In the next beat, a brutal horned form surged into view, muscles straining and wrapped in ragged pink flame, answering the protagonist's summons with terrifying physicality. Those standing nearby recoiled as the promise of destruction coalesced into a living presence that matched the private omen the protagonist had carried, turning strategy into something imminently violent and unavoidable. The protagonist's private omen hardened into flesh. He spoke a command aimed at Kella and watched as a brutal horn shape coalesced in ragged pink flame, its presence answering the dark intent he'd fed it and making nearby air crackle with menace. The violent apex gave way to a title card, and then, with an almost jarring snap, the scene shifted to daylight and tiled floors. He blinked awake in his academy uniform, baffled and asking what had happened. Passing students murmured at his return, trading recognition and speculation, while his small attendant, Rin, sat close and watched him with guarded concern. Rumors and whispered questions laced the corridor and classroom. Despite the earlier display of raw power, the protagonist now had to navigate the ordinary scrutiny of peers and the quiet, uneasy stewardship of Rin as the aftermath of the summoning lingered in expressions and whispers around him. After the uneasy return to routine, the protagonist found himself the focus of a steady, assessing gaze from Silvergirl. A close-up revealed the sting of that attention and his quiet hesitation as he thought, but that pause bled into an exaggerated, Chiba-like fantasy in which awkward, romantic sparks and floral motifs swirled around the pair, leaving both visibly flustered before a sharp cough and the scrape of footsteps yanked them back to reality. A brief corridor cut and a heavy door closed on the minor embarrassment, and the scene moved inward, away from whispers and glances, to a dim room where the protagonist stood over a spread of parchment. With a single, decisive motion, he pressed his hand to the map and announced his intent. The page and his expression marked a shift from distracted vulnerability to focused purpose as he prepared to make the map that would shape what came next. A distant city clamor gave way to a closer, anxious voice calling for Rin as a lone figure crouched on the pavement, dazed and uncertain. Questioning murmurs and the scrape of approaching footsteps turned into the arrival of stern authority, who abruptly pressed for information and bluntly asked where Kella was now. Rin's confusion hardened into visible fear under the weight of the demand, and the question hung heavy between them. The mood curdled when the light drained from the scene, and a sudden, blackened panel delivered a harsh, one-word command, "Answer." That single syllable landed like a blow, cutting hope away, and exposing Rin's panic in stark, wide-eyed detail as the interrogators closed, and the street felt suddenly small and inescapable. A heavy wooden door opened on a quiet hall before the protagonist hunched over a map at a table, pressing his fingers into the paper as he muttered to himself. He reflected that he had been lucky and that this world matched the game's mechanics, and a vivid, turquoise apparition, like an armored drake, flared in his mind as evidence of that truth. Lost in the thought, he began an unfinished sentence about what he intended to do when a flamboyant red student slid into view with a grin, offering an offhand, teasing presence that brightened the moment. Their easy banter was abruptly broken when the map or the protagonist himself emitted a sharp surge of blue power that splintered outward toward the door. The noise and light left the protagonist wide-eyed and stumbling, shocked by the unexpected discharge as the doorway rattled from the force. Entity confronted the room with a hard accusation that a secret species had been created without reporting to it, its many eyes and central sigil casting an implacable shadow. The protagonist recoiled, stunned and wide-eyed, when the tension snapped into sudden violence. Figures exploded into motion, and a rapid, brutal flurry scattered the space. Strikes landed with crimson bursts. One victim was flung backward, another screamed as fists and blades found flesh. The protagonist tasted iron, blood spilling from his mouth as he doubled over, a hoarse, broken name, F-Father, tearing out of him. Through the chaos entity remained composed, its presence cold and unyielding as the attackers withdrew into the aftermath, and the hall fell into a stunned, ominous silence. The protagonist reemerged amid the wreckage, trembling and tasting iron, his face split between panic and determination. He thrust a battered, blood-flecked map forward and cried out to his father, voice shaking as he demanded they look. Close-ups revealed the paper dotted with dark marks and box sigils. Two figures paused nearby as one spoke a curt question, but the protagonist's gaze stayed locked on the map. He traced the pattern and recognized the meaning of the clustered marks. As the room held its breath, his anger cooled into a hard, hot resolve. He vowed to recover what had been lost and to prove himself, clenching the map so tightly it trembled in his hands. The moment ended on a steely close-up of his changed eyes, the promise hanging in the charged silence as others watched him prepare to act. The sequence opened with a sudden, brutal strike that sent the protagonist reeling and howling in pain as blood sprayed and struck the ground. His anguished cry echoed beneath a rain of motion lines. An imposing figure stood over him and, harsh and uncompromising, told him to go, then immediately revealed they had consented to his departure. The protagonist, hands stained and trembling, accused them of never truly letting him go. The other reached down and set a calm, authoritative palm on the blood-specked map, admitting that, after consideration, they had allowed his absence. The senior voice then framed the moment with a cold appraisal of lineage, calling him the son of a great demon king, while the protagonist, eyes blazing and voice ragged, vowed he would be of use in determining heaven. The exchange closed on a pair of clipped reactions and tight close-ups as the elder's expression shifted, and something unexpected flashed in the protagonist's gaze that left the room on edge. The confrontation resumed with the elder's voice sliding out of the rain-dark air like a blade. He asked if the protagonist intended to be of use, and the boy, bloodied and panting, could only meet the question with silence. The elder, horned and imperious, leaned in, taunting him about the time it would take to complete his ruin, and settling a stained palm on the map as proof of judgment. The charged moment widened, the elder muttered a curt limit and dismissed him as expendable by that deadline, framing the exchange with lineage and finality. Instead of crumbling, the protagonist's expression snapped into something fiercer. Clutching the map with bloody hands, he spat back an impossible resolve, refusing the allotted days and promising a far quicker reckoning. The room held its breath as the old man's cool appraisal met the student's sudden, burning defiance. The room tightened as the protagonist, face stained with blood, thrust a weathered map forward and pleaded to be put in command of the coming operation. His voice was raw but determined as he argued that concrete goals could complete the campaign. The horned father regarded him with slow amusement, his eyes narrowing into a blade of patience before he reissued his curt limit and framed the boy as expendable should he fail. The charged silence broke into a duel of wills, the student's jaw set in defiance, promising a quicker reckoning than the allotted days, while the father's lips curled into a threat. If the map meant only words, he would shred it. Under that cold warning, the protagonist's expression flickered from fire to calculation, and he bowed his head, conceding outwardly even as the embers of rebellion still glowed behind his gaze. The protagonist stood bloodied and defiant before a reflective surface, eyes blazing as he told himself he had succeeded. The mirror showed a wavering silhouette, and for a moment he tasted triumph. That exhilaration ruptured into pain, his face contorted. He doubled over and let out a raw cry as his strength abandoned him. He crashed to his knees on the floor, clutching at his chest and bleeding, the world tilting as he collapsed forward beneath the weight of the sudden affliction. A fleeting caption of frantic thought and a distant, angry exclamation drifted through the room, while a white-haired silver girl stepped into the frame with an exaggeratedly sweet expression, her presence a stark counterpoint to his ruin. Off-panel voices and a curt curse answered the chaos, as the sequence ended with the protagonist reduced to a trembling, wounded figure on the ground. The protagonist strove to keep his promise and finished the new map within hours, standing over the carved layout as his companion watched. Ritualists formed and began to chant, their spells rippling outward as summoned creatures crept into the perimeter beyond the designated construction area. The magic bent the terrain itself, folding and transforming the landscape so the changes would remain unnoticed by casual observers. As the altered geography settled into place, he grinned at the uncanny similarity between the unfolding scene and the game-like map he had scripted. Each emergent monster and shifted ridge confirmed that events were proceeding exactly to plan. Confident and composed, he watched the simulated world become reality until, at the appointed gathering, Heaven's Hill Assembly Place, the assembled crowd erupted in bewildered shouts, the sudden astonishment marking the first public sign that something had been changed beneath their feet. After the protagonist and his allies bent terrain and summoned monsters, the changes rippled outward until the first public astonishment erupted at Heaven's Hill Assembly Place. The crowd's confusion marked the moment the hidden plan began to surface. In the council that followed, an elder noble, Prince Swam Hadeson, was told the prisoners were being transported to Heaven's Hill, and a young officer wondered if they should intervene. The prince listened, asked a single cautious question, and then refused the suggestion to act. His refusal was calm, almost measured, and accompanied by a thin, knowing smile. He made it plain he did not wish to be forced into a late scramble, and then, as if unveiling the next cadence of the scheme, announced that in 3 days the strongest squad in Talion would be formed. Tulkin was coming, setting an ominous clock on the unfolding plot, and leaving the assembly with less comfort than certainty. After the earlier upheaval at Heaven's Hill and the private council, where the prince had hinted at an incoming elite force, the public ceremony shifted into open mobilization as the newly completed elite squad stepped into view. Prince Swam Hadeson addressed the gathered assembly crowd with a confident, old-man defiance. He dismissed any hope that the Demon King could be toppled in days, praised the generations of preparation behind the squad, and then urged everyone to steel themselves. He announced the campaign's timetable, 2 days until the march reached the Demon King Castle, and sent the troops forward. Tulkin and his red-armored warriors surged out like a wound in the horizon, banners and weapons raised, and the army's momentum became a living promise and threat. In the name of their cause, they vowed to end the great Demon King's long reign. The assembly dispersed under that urgent, ominous charge, the region set on a collision course with war. Following the earlier mobilization at Heaven's Hill, Tulkin rode at the head of the newly formed elite squad and thrust them into motion with a thunderous battle cry to burn the Demon King's castle down. His red armor and the flash of raised banners cut through the air as horse and rider surged, and a blond officer at his side, Commander Klein, offered a hushed, awed remark at Tulkin's leadership. Tulkin met that praise with a confident, almost hungry grin, declaring that his guard might be the finest in the army, and vowing outright to make certain the great Demon King was killed. The squad's momentum turned into a living threat across the terrain as they sped away, banners trailing and purpose set, punctuating the region's shift from parade to inexorable march toward war. As Tulkin's bannered squad thundered outward across the countryside, the perspective cut to the citadel's soaring spires where the Demon King, Ray Kalm, sat in sovereign stillness upon his throne. He spoke with cold certainty, resolved to settle the matter with heaven, and the throne room tremored as he gathered power. Close-ups showed his hand contort with force, and his eyes harden into a blade of intent. A swirl of dark energy pulsed and coalesced around him, a taut prelude to action, and the camera snapped outward to the ramparts where unnamed castle guards readied themselves. In the final beats, the fortress responded. A cascade of violet bolts erupted from the battlements and streaked into the sky, the citadel's own counterstroke launched as war met war on the horizon. The scene opened on a press of bodies spurred onward with shouts of hurry. The assembly crowd urged to move faster as tension rippled through the plaza. Through a high-arched window, the young officer relayed news up to Prince Swam Hadeson, their exchange framed by the fortress's carved stone. Nearby, the protagonist stood apart, the citadel and distant ramparts folding into his thoughts, flashes of faces and banners, Ray Kalm's cold, sovereign stare, Tulkin's war banner, and the steady presence of Commander Klein hovered like a phalanx of warnings. He felt the weight of those names settle into a single, unavoidable fact. The coming confrontation would decide everything. As clouds scudded over the horizon and the citadel's defenses bristled beyond, the protagonist's expression narrowed into determined intent. Tomorrow was the big day. The crowd's anxiety gave way to explosive jubilation when Tulkun arrived, borne on a draconic mount above the plaza. The assembly crowd swelled and chanted his name as the war leader and his squad touched down. Commander Klein and other leaders stood at the fore, while Tulkun's officers thanked the gathered people and declared the Tulkun squad ready to march. An older commander voiced assent, and the flagship rally, impassioned cries to bring victory, rolled across the hill. Just as momentum crested and banners were raised, the grass beneath the formation shivered. A streak of cerulean light knifed through the air, and a glowing sigil bloomed where soldiers had stood. The sound cut through the cheers. Officials closest to the flare stepped forward, faces tightening with unease as the unexpected magic pooled and rose, forcing the assembly crowd and attending officers to exchange alarmed looks. A triumphant arrival had been shadowed by a sudden, inexplicable arcane omen. The assembly's fragile excitement ruptured when a piercing cerulean lance tore the air. A nearby commander screamed as the blast slammed into the ground, spraying up a storm of earth and light. Castle guard formations flickered hexagonal shields that strained against the sheer power, but the surge blasted through their line and hurled troops and banners aside. Officers barked orders, and several attendants were cast clear as people at the front cried out and scattered. Someone stammered a shocked question as the spectacle unfolded. In the wake of the strike, shadowed, hulking silhouettes gathered at the edge of the flare, unnerving shapes that absorbed the glow and advanced, turning the rally into sudden chaos. Tulkun's squad and the principal commanders were jarred into action, while the assembly crowd splintered into terrified clusters, the triumphant moment collapsing under an unexpected, ominous, arcane onslaught. While the assembly outside still reeled from the cerulean strike and the shadows that had sprung from its wake, another scene unfolded under tense, quieter light. A horned figure materialized with a cold blue aura and fixed, unreadable eyes. Witnesses inside recoiled and mouthed disbelief as a voice called the name, Ray Calm, and a stunned officer demanded how the man could be present. In a curt conference, the prince's aides recalled the fallen king's past capture and weighed what confirmation of his identity would mean, even as they watched their composure fray. The name Tulkun was spoken like a warning, and a long-haired, white-haired presence addressed the prince directly, savoring the moment and testing the court's resolve. The room tightened into a fragile, dangerous stillness. Outside chaos pressed at the walls, and the return of this one figure threatened to tilt the balance from disorder into open confrontation. A close, shadowed exchange opened the scene. Someone asked, in a tight whisper, whether the figure was awakening the power of the captain rank, and the pale respondent denied it, claiming they had not fully recovered. Before further argument could take shape, a stern voice cut through with a single, absolute command: silence. The crowned, unreadable presence who had been named Ray Calm stepped forward and declared that they would make the final decision, announcing plans to begin tomorrow in the middle of Heaven's base. The stillness snapped into a darker tempo when another figure, encircled in thrashing blue flame and horns, bared their intent and vowed to kill every single one of their foes. That oath was not idle. A surge of cerulean energy leapt across the ground, striking a nearby defender and leaving the castle guards scrambling and shouting that they had been caught off guard, as the room tipped from tense deliberation toward immediate, violent action. A thunderous proclamation split the air when a commanding voice declared, "We are Tulkun," and bellowed the order, "Tulkun squad, commence full attack." The squad surged forward with a war cry, and a focused torrent of electric blue power condensed around a combatant before detonating into the ground with bone-rattling force. The concussive strike punched a crater into the parade area, showering debris and magic across the square, and sending the assembly crowd into chaotic flight as dust and light choked the horizon. The roar of the assault carried up to the rooftops, where a lone student in uniform watched the devastation unfold with stunned disbelief, the day's tensions snapping into open violence as Tulkun's presence reshaped the scene in an instant. A sharp command split the smoke-filled air as a leader barked orders and then roared for everyone to charge. At his cry, ranks of ragged, snarling monsters surged forward in a tide of green faces and reckless momentum. The creatures thundered over the fortifications and poured toward the square, leaving the assembly crowd reeling from the sudden onslaught. A white-armored defender stepped into the breach and unleashed a searing, radiant counterstroke that cleaved through the nearest monsters, while other defenders fired back from the battlements with magical bolts to blunt the rush. The fighting became a blur of claws and flashes as damage and bodies tumbled across the grass. Cries to stop the incursion echoed, voices demanding the attackers be prevented from breaching Heaven's Hill, while soldiers and archers strained to hold the line against Tulkin's ordered assault. After the pitched clash on Heaven's Hill had raged and defenders had staved off the first monstrous tide, attention snapped to a smaller, colder scene at the assembly's edge. A young man clenched his fist, then stepped forward with a wry certainty, declaring that things were going according to plan as he advanced. His expression shifted from composed to predatory. He closed the distance toward Kella, and words, accusation and denial, passed between them as other students watched. Then violence cut through the conversation. A swift, bloody strike opened the moment like a shutter, and someone fell beneath a red bloom. A green-haired classmate's cry split the air, Tarman, and the moment ended with a dark, remorseless voice, insisting there was no place here for the one named, driving the crowd's shock into an uneasy, dangerous silence. The brief, terrible calm that fell over the assembly shattered into violence. A dark, shadowed figure lashed out with a blinding green strike that tore into a young man, the motion cut across the panel like a blade. The victim crumpled and cried out as crimson welled where the energy struck, the attack's brutality leaving no room for immediate rescue. From just off-frame, a cool, commanding voice called, "Now, Seldura," and a second, colder force answered, a flash of blue power that swept down to secure the advantage. The wounded student stumbled beneath the twin onslaught, clutching at his belly as pain and shock flooded him. His scream hung in the air while nearby faces registered horror. In the space between blows, the crowd's outrage stalled beneath the practical cruelty of the assault. The attackers did not hesitate to finish what had been started, and the assembly found itself watching a merciless, coordinated strike unfold. Against the lingering din of the shattered assembly, the two white-haired, horned conspirators leaned forward and began to laugh, a sharp, predatory sound that sliced through the stunned silence. Their faces split into identical, triumphant grins as they watched the scene below, delighting in the ruin they had helped orchestrate. The view cut to the protagonist, blood flecking his skin and sweat beating at his temples. His breath came quick and ragged as he looked up at the pair. Surprise and pain warred across his features until comprehension settled in, the moment resolved, not into rescue, but into a terminal clarity. In a tight, cinematic close-up, his pupil gleamed gold, the intensity of the image magnifying the final thought that crossed his mind, that this was how it ended. The conspirator's mirth became the frame around his resignation, and the page left him suspended between burning awareness and the quiet collapse of hope. The conspirators watched from above, their laughter still hanging in the air as the protagonist's face snapped up in shock. Pain and understanding collided across his features until his pupil flared a hard, metallic gold, a brief, luminous verdict that hardened the moment into finality. He registered with a frozen clarity the thought that this might be the end, and then his weight tipped over the ledge. He plunged outward and down, passing rooftop edges and windows as a mottled green glow pooled on the ground beneath him where indistinct figures gathered. Blood streaked from his wounds and red slashes of motion marked his descent. For an instant his wide, golden eye remained fixed, surrender and resolve reflected in it. The page lingered on his tumbling body and the spread of light below, the conspirator's earlier mirth, now the bitter contour of a closing scene. After the fall, the protagonist lay collapsed on the paving, blood pooling around him as he gasped ragged sounds, and his golden eye fluttered in pain. Two of the conspirators approached with matching smiles, trading cold words about going to see their father now that the scene was set. Their mirth was abruptly broken by a swift, blue-tinged slash that struck with brutal precision. One conspirator flinched and cried out in disbelief as blood spattered his face. The other reacted with a cruel, taunting calm, striking, mocking, and then seizing the moment to press the assault even as his companion weakened. Despite the wound, he grinned and announced their nature, brandishing bloodied fingers and a confidence that weapons existed to be taken, leaving the aftermath tense and raw with menace. After the fall and the conspirators' brief, bloody exchange, the white-haired attacker moved forward with a manic grin and a cold promise. She taunted the ruined gathering, held a blood-red gem aloft, and declared that if she killed here, then she alone would remain as successor. The protagonist, who had been bruised and on the paving not long before, answered with a single name, Elijah, and the cry shook him upright. He lunged with raw fury, shouting that he would kill her, and their confrontation snapped into motion. She laughed and countered with vicious agility while he closed at impossible speed. Blades and bursts of colored energy streaked across the scene, each strike answering the other's violence. The encounter became a blur of motion and impact as the two forces met, tearing through the air and leaving the ground scarred by their collision, the outcome unresolved and the atmosphere electric with danger. A thunderous flare split the sky, and the shock washed over a narrow street, where a body rolled and came to rest against the cobbles. The camera closed on the fallen figure, hair plastered with blood, eyes half open and glassy as a name or a curse trembled past their lips. Blood pooled across paving stones, while the scene swung outward to show the attacker striding through the ruin, hair wild and grin hardening into intent. Fresh wounds marked the ground where others had fallen, and small, pained movements betrayed failing resistance as the injured tried, and failed, to rise. The white-haired assailant halted above the ruined figure, raised some cruel herald of violence, and gathered herself for a conclusive motion. Her silhouette cast long shadows across a cityscape singed by earlier impacts. Silence settled briefly, broken only by wet breaths in the scrape of fabric, and the tableau held, the victor looming, the ruined body prone, and the outcome uncertain as the attacker prepared to finish what the clash had begun. The scene opened on the ruined street, where the white-haired attacker loomed over a bloodied, glass-eyed victim, poised to finish the prone figure as wet breaths and the scrape of fabric marked the moment. The camera yanked outward to a wider ridge, where ritualists completed a coordinated invocation, and a jagged purple sigil flared into being above the landscape. The sky split, and an orb of churning darkness spat forth a seething swarm. Monsters poured through the breach and descended the hills toward the gathered masses, and the assembly crowd scattered in panicked waves. Small bands of defenders and castle guards strained at the front, raising spells and firing magical bolts that lit the air in futile arcs, while a handful of desperate bystanders lunged to protect those near them. The attacker's brutal motion froze against the distant crescendo of destruction, and the tableau closed with chaos unfurling across the valley as the ritual's spawn overwhelmed open ground and hope grew thin. As the valley convulsed under the ritual's spawn, a new, focused assault cleaved the air. A circular sigil flared, and a searing column of light coalesced into a sustained, dragon-like breath that scorched toward the ground. The blast originated from a gaping, fanged maw that poured forth molten energy and split the smoke. A lone figure, faces set against the glare, uttered a terse recognition that it had been a long time since they had seen a dragon's breath. The beam connected with the ruined terrain, sending sparks and shards upward while a smaller, snarling draconic head snapped into view, and then a larger, more monstrous visage reared behind it, roaring with savage intent. The eruption of fire and sound redirected the battlefield's momentum, forcing defenders and attackers alike to reckon with a single overwhelming force as the chaos below intensified into a concentrated, destructive centerpiece. Elijah dove from above in a crimson blur, claws and cape shredding the earth as her assault cleaved through ranks and left a spray of blood and fallen debris in her wake. A nearby figure shouted in frustration, a harsh, anguished cry that one had been struck, and defenders immediately tightened formation, conjuring a bristling wall of shimmering wards and holding lines of spearmen and archers steady. From the battlements and flanks, Castle Guard unleashed disciplined volleys of magical bolts that stitched blue tracery through the smoke, each strike trying to blunt the momentum of the dive. The air then split with a cold, furious brilliance as the earlier ritual's draconic breath flared into being again, a roiling column of concentrated energy that roared down the field and redirected every available force toward its path. From the rear, a lone cloaked figure watched the devastation unfold and stepped forward, intent and small beneath the scale of the conflagration. A single shout, sharp, desperate, split the air, hands and faces turning toward the source as a chorus of blue, crackling arcs gathered and descended in a spiraling, hungry mass. The energy stitched itself into bone and crown until a hulking, skeletal demonic figure stood fully formed, its aura laced with cobalt flame, the glyph-marked chest and crown made clear who had returned. Those nearest recoiled and barked orders, a red-faced defender answering with a promise to hold the line, while others braced blades and spell sigils. The emergence stole the momentum of every nearby action. Spells shifted, stances tightened, and two figures traded charged glances before lunging forward, their expressions a mixture of fury and dread. Even as the more experienced fighters moved to engage, onlookers registered the scale of the threat and prepared themselves for the brutal contest that had just begun. A red-haired commander shouted sharp orders and begged the lines to hold, rallying soldiers to protect a promised target as panic and resolve rippled through the ranks. Blue, hungry arcs of energy stitched together above the field and condensed into a hulking skeletal form until the Demon King, Ray Calm, stood fully formed with a glyph-marked chest and crown. The mass of onlookers recoiled and cursed at the sight. Veteran defenders barked that they would hold the line while banners unfurled, and a tide of soldiers braced their shields and raised weapons, charging forward beneath flapping standards. Close-up reactions, sneers, terror, and grim determination punctuated the chaos as the newly arisen monarch fixed his gaze on the assembly. Wordless starbursts and dark narration framed his return as an inevitable, world-shaping threat. The field filled with the roar of men and the cold certainty that the violent confrontation had only just begun. The field had already convulsed into chaos when the Demon King, Ray Calm, rose from the coalescing blue mass and fixed his dreadful presence on the gathered lines. Soldiers and the assembly crowd recoiled as banners fluttered and commanders steeled themselves. A red-haired leader remained prominent in the foreground, framed against the throng and the monstrous emergence, while calmer, almost amused eyes watched from nearby, the protagonist's smirk suggesting he believed Ray had factored this very outcome into his plans. That cold speculation barely settled when the scene split open again. From the shifting rumble, a shadowy, multi-eyed face with a central sigil resolved itself, staring down from the surge of energy. The entity's appearance brought a sharper edge to the dread. With that new presence looming, the whispered analysis about motives was pushed aside by an urgency none could ignore. The moment closed on the entity's grin and an abrupt dismissal. This was not the time for conjecture, only for what came next. The surge of chaos culminated when Ray Calm completed his change and towered in a new, blindingly blue form that radiated primal violence. The air itself seemed to slice around him as he focused on the lines before him. A jagged thought broke the roar, a vow to kill them there and then, and its cruelty settled like frost over the assembly crowd. Nearby commanders vocalized the obvious. Ray intended to go all out in his final form, and that brutal certainty forced an instant, terrible choice. Voices snapped to life, urging every soldier to commit and place their lives on the line. Men and officers moved with the single-minded speed of people confronting annihilation. One figure tore forward as tensions erupted into motion, and the camera closed on a single, burning eye, an omen that the coming clash would be decisive and costly for everyone in its path. The sky had shredded into streaks of pink and blue that slashed down and buried themselves into the earth. The cascade of energy fractured the courtyard and flung a small white object to the ground like a thrown token. In the settling dust, a solitary figure remained, rigid and silhouetted against the ruined stones, as smoke and debris curled around his feet. Close-up, Silvergirl appeared battered, blood at her mouth and eyes wide with terror. She clawed at her face and begged, repeating a single, raw plea, while the world around her blurred with the impact. For a long beat, nothing answered that plea but the settling dust. Then distant, hard voices and a shout reverberated off the cold masonry of the assembly hall, a sound that suggested orders, alarm, and the immediate tracing of consequences to come. The scene closed on that echoing stone, charged and waiting for the next motion to split the silence. The echoing stones and settling dust from the courtyard's rupture had barely cooled when the scene tightened into a smaller, more personal confrontation. In a dim room, the protagonist sat shirtless, the center of the page dominated by raw, stitched wounds along his torso and the dark bruises that framed them. Silvergirl hovered nearby, sharp, exasperated, demanding answers and refusing to let him dismiss what had been done to his body. He wore a brittle grin, feigning lightness as he flexed and tried to stand, but the scars spoke of recent violence and stubborn endurance. She snapped at him for risking himself, and for the recklessness the wound represented then, abruptly, shifted from rebuke to a steadier, practical care. She steadied his movement and reached in close, correcting his posture and insisting he not walk away from this battered truth. The exchange ended with her expression narrowed and resolute, the charged quiet from the ruined courtyard replaced by a taut, intimate vigilance between them. Following the private exchange over his stitched wounds, the quiet tightened into a blunt, public confrontation on the page. The protagonist pointed and pressed Silvergirl with an accusation that she had deliberately injured herself to draw attention, his voice sharp and unyielding. Silvergirl's eye widened at the charge, but she quickly masked the hurt with an almost triumphant smile and insisted she was telling the truth. He continued to press, and she moved in close, taking his sleeve and attempting to redirect the argument away from escalation. An instructor cut through them with a harsh demand for order, and under that glare Silvergirl's smile slid into something colder and more controlled, an answered provocation that registered on the protagonist's face as a new, disturbing realization. The scene closed on that charged standoff, accusation, a baffling rebuttal, and a small but decisive shift in the balance between them. The argument between the protagonist and Silvergirl turned raw and personal on the page. Silvergirl spat taunts while the protagonist stood bloodied and silent, forced into a strained, bitter restraint. When Silvergirl called him an idiot, the tension snapped outward, someone's hand came down on the protagonist's head, and a voice cut through the square, demanding clarity and provoking alarm. Silvergirl's triumphant sneer belied the damage between them, and a bystander's startled cry, Kella's name, registered like a fracture in the moment. The crowd's attention shifted to a figure who moved away, and murmurs tried to place who had appeared on the rooftop. The scene closed with an unsettling reveal. A new, pale, pink-haired presence watched from darkness, eyes bright and grin wide, and he boasted inwardly that the night's violence was still playing into his design, leaving the assembled with an aftertaste of orchestration rather than chance. The square's brittle argument folded into something colder when the pale, pink-haired presence, the same manic figure the crowd had whispered about, crowned himself unbroken and declared his scheme intact. His grin was a promise that the night's chaos had been orchestrated. As murmurs rippled, Silvergirl registered the new threat with a stunned, soft call, and the protagonist reacted in a single decisive motion. He grabbed Silvergirl, dragging her close amid her shocked protests while the onlookers scattered. Unyielding, he asserted that his survival meant change was possible now, then produced and slammed his palm to a glowing sigil device on his person. The pink-haired watcher answered in kind, channeling a crimson, concentrated light and intoning an invocation that framed the coming rupture as freedom. The panels closed on that converging motion, an intimate, desperate vow to alter fate and a distant architect amplifying the impulse into something that would ripple outward beyond the crowd. A pale, pink-haired presence spoke first, her voice fragile as she called out to a figure she named Master and invoked Kella, drawing the square's attention to the horned woman. The camera cut to a bloodied, resolute youth who challenged that command, his expression fierce, but tired as he told Kella to live the life she wanted, an almost pleading defiance painted across his face. Silvergirl registered the exchange with wide, stunned eyes, the moment hung between them. A lone figure moved next, electricity or sigil light crackling around his silhouette as he strode forward, the scene contracting into a private confrontation. Beside him, a small, white-haired person dropped to a knee in supplication, pressing themselves toward the taller figure with visible anguish. The sequence closed on a raw close-up. Grief and determination warred on the kneeling face as the gathered crowd watched the fragile, consequential choice begin to take shape. After the fragile supplication and the tense exchange that had left a kneeling figure raw and watched, one student finally broke away, shouting for others not to follow, while companions argued in the rafters of a dim building. The camera tore outward to a rugged plateau where pursuit met judgment. An armored combatant raised a blade and spat the single, bitter word, "monster," as the wounded youth stood exposed to the wind. Despite deep, smoking wounds across his torso, he did not collapse. Instead, dark sigils and a central emblem flared on his skin, and additional eyes opened and scattered across his face and chest like cold, searching moons. Blue-black energy licked his torn flesh, and the pupil of one eye sharpened into an uncanny symbol, the human outline warping as the hidden power brewed to life. Those who had followed, friends and foes alike, fell silent, the air charged as a sealed force reasserted itself in the body before them. The wounded youth staggered, pain and fury etched across his face as the hidden emblem beneath his skin flared to life. Dark sigils crawled outward while new, inhuman eyes opened on his face and chest. Blue-black energy licked torn flesh and reshaped the human outline into something bestial and precise. He embodied the sealed force that had been reasserting itself, and with each shift of muscle, the landscape of the moment changed from desperate defense to immovable inevitability. The camera tore away to a ruined field where armor and bodies lay broken, halted mid-conflict. The silence that followed carried the weight of defeat. A final, intimate close-up of that newly formed eye punctuated the proclamation that no human could stop the coming disaster, and the scene ended on the stark revelation that the corpses strewn below had already been counted as his soldiers. A blood-slick maw opened first, crimson collecting along torn flesh, and a jagged tooth glinting wetly. The sound was a ragged, animal rasp. The view pulled back as the wound joined a larger transformation, revealing a crowned, multi-eyed head with a central sigil that fixed the scene with a cold, unblinking stare. The host, already reshaped by the sealed force, admitted the limit of its reserves, acknowledging that its remaining power had dwindled to a single ember. This was its last remaining mana. A golden slit of light sharpened at the sigil as the being concentrated that final spark, and the restraint fell away. With a decisive, almost ceremonial motion, the gathered energy compressed and then detonated outward, a vertical pillar of violet-white force spiraling and smashing into sky and ground.